Thousands of demonstrators gathered in front of the presidential palace in Khartoum in Sudan for 2 days. They are calling for the military to seize power as Sudan grapples with the biggest political crisis in its 2-year-old transition. The military and civilian groups have been sharing power in the East African country in an uneasy alliance since the toppling of long-standing President Omar al-Bashir in 2019.
Following a failed coup attempt in September attributed to forces loyal to Omar al-Bashir, military leaders have been demanding reforms to the so-called Forces of Freedom and Change coalition and to the civilian cabinet. Civilian leaders, however, have accused them of aiming for a power grab. A military-aligned faction of the FFC, including armed groups that rebelled against Bashir, called for Saturday's protests.
We came here today to bring back the revolution to its initial path, to its motto of peace, freedom and justice. Sudan is big enough for everyone, without one small group taking over at the expense of the rest. We hope that today we have a technocratic government, not a government of establishments or parties. The people now sitting on the throne, in power that is, have raised banners.
Ahead of the demonstrations, members of an unidentified armed group removed security barriers around government buildings and prevented the police and security forces from going about their work. At the root of the conflict are disputes on issues of justice, military restructuring, and the dismantling of the financial apparatus of Bashir's regime.
We are behind the army and behind Burhan. There is no one but the army. The army is what we love, what makes us feel safe. The army is able, they are able to protect the country and lead it properly. When someone is afraid, they go and hide. But the only place we have to hide behind is these forces.
In a speech on Friday, Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok presented a roadmap out of the crisis and warned that not finding a resolution would throw the country's future to the wind. Meanwhile, pro-civilian groups have called for more protests.
For some analysis, we're now joined by Dr. Jok Madut Jok, a professor of citizenship and public affairs at the Syracuse University. Dr. Jok, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Thank you, sir. Very good evening to you. Happy to be back.
Indeed, it's an absolute pleasure having you join us this evening, Dr. Jok. I mean, on Friday, Sudan's Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok said on state television that he actually agreed with the main political players on a roadmap to end this crisis. Do you think these protests will gain steam?
These protests will most likely gain steam depending on which side the current military leadership, the ruling military council, which side they will take. Sudan is a very complex country. And for the last 2 years, since al-Bashir was toppled, as you said in your opening remarks, the whole world has celebrated a kind of a shift in the Sudanese politics, where now the focus should be improving the economy that was destroyed by dictatorship, bringing peace to all the Sudan's peripheries in the Red Sea, in Darfur, in southern Kordofan and southern Blue Nile. These were very, very important items on the agenda of the revolution government. But there are two parties to this government that don't seem to get along on that agenda. One being the military council led by General al-Burhan, who seemed to be now trying to get the military to full control of the state. And then on the other, the civilian technocratic government run by Dr. Hamdok, which is saying that the revolution was based on ensuring that democracy is exercised, all the warring areas are brought into the fold so that Sudan can live in peace, with its own parties with the revolutionary parties being on board with that agenda. And there seemed to be this pull between the military leaders of the current government and the civilian leaders of this government. And so I think if the military council sides with this call that the Sudanese people are now asking for a military return into power, I think that those protests will lead in that direction. But I also feel that those people who don't want the military to come back ever again, especially being suspicious that those Al-Burhan and Hameti are remnants of Bashir, I think there is going to be a confrontation between those who want a military back and those who don't want a military back, and that Sudan should be run with this civilian government until at the end of the interim period, when the Sudanese people will go to the polls to decide the future of their country. And I think there is now a threat to the stability to that government that was brought by that amazing revolution that the Sudanese people brought about in 2019.
Okay. And the country's security service has slapped a travel ban on members of a task force overseeing the country's transition to democracy. What is informing such overtly stringent measures?
Well, I think as the military seem to regain control of the country, they are suspicious of numerous people, including people who are party to the wars in Darfur and Kordofan and Blue Nile and the civilian government, because they are now increasingly being accused of being in the pay of foreign, or at least being co-opted by foreign forces aimed at destabilizing Sudan. So they are preventing their travel because they think these are the people who will go and talk excuse me, going to talk about the failures of the military leadership. And so they are prevented as a way to ensure that they don't say these things on a global stage at the African Union or the United Nations.
Okay. And Dr. Jok, the authorities made up of the military and civilians are supposed to lead the country towards elections, are they not? But they keep pushing back the deadline, currently to 2023. So what are some of the main key issues of contention within the Forces of Freedom and the Change Coalition and the civilian cabinet?
So you have the Change Coalition, the Freedom and Change Coalition, which is made up of people who were actually on the streets to topple al-Bashir in 2019. Mm-hmm. And then because of that negotiation, now the military insisted on having a portion of that. And so you have basically a bifurcated system of government where you have the military still trying to insist on total control of the state. And then you have a civilian government which is saying that we must democratize, we must improve the economy, we must pursue the people who destroyed our economy, the loyalists to al-Bashir. So I think that remains a bone of contention between these two sections of the same government. And I think it is not going to be resolved until one side has indeed ensured that the Sudanese people are behind them. The way I'm seeing so many people now going into the protesting in front of government buildings, and the army and the police are not stopping them, suggests that the military is actually encouraging this protest, because the protests seem to be increasingly against the civilian part of the government in favor of the military junta. And if the junta has its way, then they will push the elections until they have organized themselves to ensure that the person who comes to power following the election is somebody who is going to maintain the same policies dating back to al-Bashir time. This is the ominous situation that is facing the Sudanese people, the possibility of return of allies of al-Bashir through Hameti, through al-Burhan. The country is not going to be able to be stabilized because now Darfur, Red Sea Hills, Kordofan, in fact, a lot of the military people who are protesting today were saying that there has been too much power given to the people of Darfur, especially to the Fur and Zagawa, who had been fighting the Sudan government. And I think if that doesn't happen, the Sudan will go back to war in all its peripheries. And it's going to look like it's falling apart once again, especially at the seams.
Yeah, and the stability will basically be, a challenge because the country is caught between inflation approaching 400% on the one hand and an austerity decreed by the International Monetary Fund on the other hand. So how do these protests further complicate the economic situation in Sudan, if at all?
They very much complicate that situation because the austerity measures are required as a basis for investment, as a basis for further loan from IMF and World Bank for debt relief. If you don't go ahead with the austerities, you will lose those allies. But if you go ahead with them, you will lose your people who are now saying they can no longer afford a piece of bread, and so you are in a serious bind as a government. The easiest thing that could be done is for the two sides of the current government to sit together and speed through the transitional period, which will then give the world a sense that democratization is happening and not push back the date for elections, because the Sudanese people are waiting for that time when they will, in 30-something years, they will have finally been able to vote in the people they want, the leaders they want, rather than the military having ruled for this long.
Yeah. And to what extent then are forces who are close to the disposed, Omar al-Bashir influencing these fractures that we see within the coalition government?
My sense is that they are very much influential, especially through the military leaders themselves who are still remaining in the government. A lot of Sudanese people suspect that these military leaders, which are part of the coalition government, are actually al-Bashir allies. This is why they drag their feet in trying them in court and in cooperating with the ICC. And perhaps there is a plot for al-Bashir party, even if al-Bashir himself doesn't come back, that the people who will come to control the Sudan heretofore are people who will be his allies and are favoring his release and his freedom.
All right, Dr. Jok, lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you, sir.
All right, that was Dr. Jok Madut Jok. He's a professor of citizenship and public affairs at Syracuse University, joining us via Zoom.